there's this concept of what is called anti-stratting within Counter-Strike Go. And I think this idea or this terminology is really good to use within League of Legends, and the idea that if you think classically, I think the most common anti-strat theory is within the draft phase, right, where a team does a specific composition because they think it's actually the best against, this specific team or whatnot. Or, the fact that maybe a general gameplay style of like, oh, okay, we should play faster against this team that likes to draw the game out and kind of extend and go towards the late game, right? So you beat them in the early game or whatnot. And so I think this conception of what is anti-stratting within Counter-Strike Go, where, they have this idea of certain teams will do certain flashes, like, right, like visualize Dust 2 in your mind, right, because that's probably the most common map, where, someone will flash bang, from B tunnels, and it'll always be two flashbangs, and then a smoke comes out shortly after, and then you have three people rushing through B tunnels, into the bomb site or whatnot. And it's like, okay, like that could be a classic strat of, some team that is on like the terrorist side or whatnot. And so you, as the enemy team, the CT team, you just be like, okay, this team has a tendency to do this generally when it comes into the second round and they have SMGs or something like that, right? After the pistol round. So like these are anti-strats of specific teams. One instance of what you could think of within a League of Legends reference would be, of course, the draft phase in 2015 at MSI, EDG versus SKT. Remember when Faker picked his, LeBlanc, which I think was undefeated at the time, and then Pawn ends up picking Morgana, right? And they left LeBlanc open specifically because they wanted to anti-strat Faker, and they just shut him down completely through that entire game, because like Faker's obviously the focal point of SKT. So you could think of these specific anti-strats and that the fact that they do exist, but I just think there really hasn't been terminology to pinpoint towards an idea of how these teams are specifically playing. Now, what I do think is a bad thing about anti-stratting just in general is the fact that you kind of put all your eggs in one basket, right, in a couple different counter scenarios. And that makes you focus more of your prep on those specific strategies against that particular team. And if things don't work out in your way, then you have nothing to really fall back on. So that's the bad part about anti-stratting so specifically. And this is a hallmark within Counter-Strike, is that some teams will try and anti-strat very hard, and then once the enemy team is kind of fluid or maybe they play loose, suddenly they don't know what to do because they've developed all these different plans surrounding specific tendencies or specific strats that they thought the enemy was going to do, but in fact they aren't doing, right? They're playing maybe unorthodox to the style that they previously were doing. So I think that is the negative effects of what anti-stratting is. And, you could even think towards the draft of, if you're so, laser focused on a specific draft, maybe that the enemy team is supposed to do, and then they throw in a wild card pick, which I think actually is one of the big reasons as to why when you see these off meta picks or off chance picks, they actually work quite well within a best of 5 scenario against any enemy team. And it's because people specifically hone in too much on anti-stratting within the draft phase. And I think this is, the equivalence of what could be Counter-Strike in essence. Obviously Counter-Strike doesn't have a draft phase, right? But it is like the layout or the scaffolding of, a particular round or whatnot. And they fall into that groove of what they think the enemy is going to do. And then they get caught out by surprise if the enemy pulls out a strat that they haven't seen within a specific demo reel or whatnot. So I think with that, the idea of anti-stratting is actually very difficult against teams that are kind of off the cuff, right? And they're kind of wild and don't seem to follow any particular logic or rule set. You could even think of Cloud9 previously, right? And the fact that Blabber was very off the cuff, which is, I think, the initial impression, or rather advantage, that a lot of young junglers get, is that because they don't follow this particular rule set, because they come in with a fresh mind and fresh ideas, and if you don't inhibit them, at least, then they're able to come in and kind of wreck faces initially, because you can't get a bead on exactly what this player is going to do, and that is especially true of Blabber, right? So now this whole abstraction of, anti-stratting, or maybe even setting your own specific core set of plays that you make, just in general to fall back on. This goes down to both the ideas of what I would consider generalities versus specificities, right? And these are like the two opposing viewpoints in essence, because when you think of a generality, just in the broad spectrum of thought, or within your everyday life, generalities are there. Or you could even think of this more acutely as like a stereotyping of a particular situation, or you could even think stereotyping of specific groups or whatnot. The reason why they exist, or the reason why generalities exist, is because it is just a compression of data. That's all that it is. Because as such, you can't really house, a wide variety of things at the specific level, because it would just be too many different things that you need to remember, right? So in order to remember the general theory of things, you need to compress that data. And that's what generalities do. They allow you to compress data. Now, obviously, this can be bad and can be hijacked, right? With like, racism or sexism or whatnot, just general like bad stereotypes. Yes, those are, I guess, areas in which you could see that generalities are bad, which a lot of people point towards, but they simply miss the mark of exactly the utility of what generalities are to begin with, just from a fundamental like human evolution aspect. Like I always compare the idea that the reason why stereotypes are important to a degree, as long as you limit them, is like stereotypes have helped human civilization survive in the aspect of, well, if you meet a tiger out in the wild, like you're going to stereotype that tiger and say, oh, well, I'm going to stay away from that guy because he might fuck me up. Chances are, if I go near him, he probably will fuck me up. Now, that's a good stereotype. That's good generalization. And it's the idea that at some point you have to generalize to be able to function within the world. Because if you don't generalize, then you're just overwhelmed by information, and you have to process each situation uniquely. And not everyone has time for that throughout every specific instance or action in which they're involved in or they participate in. So therefore, generalities are good. And same thing within, the video game itself, is that you have to develop a general theory of how you want to play the game and then go from there. Because otherwise, you're just going to be all over the place, and you're going to make specific strategies which aren't congruent with each other because you don't have a theory about the game. And then this allows you to then, of course, go from the abstract idea, which is the generality idea, over into the specific idea to then apply it to, that specific scenario or whatnot. This is why math formulas exist, is because it's a generality, and then you just apply it to the specificity. That's the best way to learn, in fact. Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum, specificity is actually very good, because it allows you to, I guess, see specific versions of a problem and to solve that problem based upon the locality of said problem, right? And so this allows you to develop nuance and develop judgment kind of on the fly. And, there are people that talk about, like, nowadays it's like, oh, to know your truth or whatnot. And to some degree that is good, because obviously life is subjective in that sense. And same thing with playing League of Legends. It is subjective sometimes of what decisions that you should make or should not make, depending upon the situation, right? But with that said, specificity can be bad because, as I said, you can be trapped within a specific scenario, which will then take you longer to process, because first of all, you don't have time to process the specificity. And then second of all, you don't have a game plan going into it, because you need to know exactly what the specific situation is, which is currently unfolding, right before your eyes, right? So it's generally bad to always rely on, that specific scenario. And this leads me to the other idea of just esports teams or League of Legends teams in general. When I hear some of the comms, or maybe, some of the afterthoughts when they're in team discussions or whatnot, and they're discussing maybe a particular scenario with, around Baron or around Dragon, and the arguments often end up shifting disingenuously, I think, of opposing one or the other situation, of someone speaking generally and someone speaking specifically. And the fact that if someone is speaking generally, you can always just combat that idea with a specificity of just like, well, yeah, generally, sure, you could do that, but this is this specific situation. And so therefore you're wrong because, we should have done this, this, and this. Or as a specificity, someone did a specific thing, right, because of this particular scenario or whatnot. But that doesn't always happen at that particular moment, because it's just like it's a 20% chance, and oftentimes that's never going to happen. So you fall back to the generality and you say, well, generally these guys do this, so I don't know why you actually did this action, right? You should have known that you should roll for the 80% play instead. So it's a very, I think, disingenuous way to argue when you kind of go about an argument in terms of not engaging with their ideas of if they speak in a generality within that specific moment, or if they speak in a specificity of that particular play or whatnot. So I just think this overall idea of anti-stratting and also having a game plan of what you're going to do within, a particular game or a particular series or whatnot, both of these are very important. And this is what they call nuance, in fact, is that it's not so cut and dry that you could use one or the other constantly. In order to be the best team, you have to use both in order, to win and obviously win worlds eventually. So I don't think teams talk about this enough, about anti-stratting or general strategies. I think some teams focus on anti-stratting too much, and I think some teams focus on just general strats and don't have a particular acute game plan when it comes to another team, which is also why we see that there are sometimes teams that are the kryptonite of other teams, right? Famously, of course, G2 was the kryptonite of Korean teams. And I do think it's because the Korean teams went in with a general idea of how they want to play the game. But when it came to G2, they didn't have a specific game plan going against them, right? And so you can see as to why they would fall into this mindset, and that's a bad thing to do. So you must use both of these different thought processes when you're approaching League of Legends, and I just don't think anyone has really ever talked about it, nor have they developed the terminology of maybe what is a general strat and what is an anti-strat, which we can then use from the likes of another esport, CSGO. Even though that it is an FPS, there are still some similar ties just when it comes to general strategy.